Dr. Baliga here. This podcast is on opening up the economy. This is derived from Mr. Bill Gates' memo titled The First Modern Pandemic. It's a verbatim reading from his memo or blog post available at gatesnotes.com. Opening up, most developed countries will be moving into the second phase of the epidemic in the next 2 months, he says. In one sense, it's easy to describe this next phase. It is semi-normal. People can go out, but not as often, and not to crowded places. Picture restaurants that only seat people at every other table, airplanes where every middle seat is empty. Schools are open, but you can't fill a stadium with 70,000 people. People are working some and spending some of their earnings, but not as much as they were before the pandemic. In short, times are abnormal, but not as abnormal as during the first phase. The rules about what is allowed should change gradually so that we can see if the contact level is starting to increase the number of infections. Countries will be able to learn from other countries that have strong testing systems in place to inform them when problems come up. The example of gradual reopening in Microsoft China, which has roughly 6,200 employees, so far about half are now coming into work. They're continuing to provide support to employees who want to work at home. They insist people with symptoms stay at home. They require masks and provide hand sanitizer and do more intensive cleaning. Even at work, they apply distancing rules and only allow travel for exceptional reasons. China has been conservative about opening up and has so far avoided any significant rebound. The basic principle should be to allow activities that have a large benefit to the economy or human welfare but pose a small risk of infection. But as you dig into the details and look across the economy, the picture quickly gets complicated. It's not as simple as saying you can do X but not Y. The modern economy is far too complex and interconnected for that. For example, restaurants can keep diners 6 feet apart, but they will have a working supply chain for their ingredients. Will they be profitable with this reduced capacity? The manufacturing industry will need to change factories to keep workers further apart. Most factories will be able to adapt to new rules without a large productivity loss. But how do the people employed in these restaurants and factories get to work? Are they taking a bus or train? What about suppliers who provide and ship parts to the factory? And when should companies start insisting their employees show up at work? There are no easy answers to these questions. Ultimately, leaders at the national, state, and local levels will need to make trade offs based on the risks and benefits of opening various parts of the economy. In the US, it'll be tricky. If one state opens up too fast and starts to see lots of infections, should other states try to stop people moving across state boundaries? School offers a big benefit and should be a priority. Large sporting and entertainment events probably will not make the cut for a long time. The economic benefit of live audience doesn't measure up to the risk of spreading the infection. Other activities fall into gray areas, such as church services or a high school soccer game with a few dozen people on the sidelines. There's one other factor that is hard to account for. That is human nature. Some people will be naturally reluctant to go out even once the government says it's okay. Others will take the opposite view. They will assume that the government is being overly cautious and start bucking the rules, leaders will need to think carefully about how to strike the right balance here. Mr. Gates, in his conclusion of this memo or blog post, writes, Melinda and I grew up learning that World War II was the defining moment of our parents' generation. In a similar way, the COVID pandemic, the first modern pandemic, will define this era. No one who lives through pandemic 1 will ever forget it, and it's impossible to overstate the pain that people are feeling now and will continue to feel for years to come. The heavy cost of the pandemic for lower paid and poor people is a special concern for Melinda and me. The disease is disproportionately hurting poorer communities and racial minorities. Likewise, the economic impact of the shutdown is hitting low income minority workers the hardest. Policy workers will need to make sure that as the country opens up, the recovery doesn't make inequality even worse than it already is. At the same time, we are impressed how the world is coming together to fight this fight. Every day we talk to scientists at universities and small companies, CEO of pharmaceutical companies, or heads of government to make sure that the new tools I've discussed become available as soon as possible. And there are so many heroes to admire right now, including the healthcare workers in the front line. When the world eventually declares the pandemic over, we all have all of them to thank for it. So this concludes Mr. Bill Gates' 40,000 foot perspective on this pandemic. And I'm glad that he and other community leaders are thinking through these things. We physicians are more concerned about, is there enough PPE? How are our patients doing? But having a global insight on this pandemic is helpful. As I said at the very first podcast in this series, derived from his blog post, we all will have to think as public health officials from here forwards.